Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's KLF Bhava Samvad session. I am Richa, commissioning editor at Penguin Random House India, and I'm here with Peggy Mohan to discuss her new book, Wanderers, Kings, Merchants: The Story of India Through Its Languages. It's a path-making book on the social history of the Indian subcontinent. I would like to thank the Kalinga Literary Festival for organizing this session. The festival is held to celebrate the creative spirit of Bhubaneswar city and commemorate the literary diversity it offers. To briefly introduce the author, Peggy Mohan has a PhD in linguistics from the University of Michigan. She has taught linguistics at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Howard University and mass communications at Jamia Millia Islamia. She is the author of three novels and has contributed to reputed scholarly publications. She has developed educational television programs for children and now teaches music in New Delhi. Peggy, hi, delighted to be talking to you about your book today. Let's hold it up for our audience to see. Um, so this illustration has been done by Peggy herself, and there are these scripts, the scripts, different scripts of
Mhm.
Indian languages
Yes.
that form the background of the cover. So we'll be taking a few questions at the end of the discussion. Please type them in the comments box. So Peggy, let's get into it. When did you start connecting your linguistics research with the history of the Indian subcontinent?
Slowly, I think initially it's very difficult to live in North India and not see the parallels initially with Southern Europe or Northern Europe, or that you have a family of languages strewn across, and what is the nature of their linkage. And slowly, just as the European languages are not really similar to Sanskrit, no karaks, no nothing like that, you found the same thing in India. And I more started thinking that there had to be something. And as I went further and further in my book, I think I found much more than I expected to find. I just blundered into a rich field and started seeing more and more, and including things I just did not expect, like how to take things further back. I started with Sanskrit thinking I would find something simple and familiar. It was not simple, it was not totally familiar, but yet it also matched up in its own way with the other things that we're finding all over the subcontinent. There's a pattern, a repeating pattern. And I expected to find something. In the middle, despaired that I was not going to find it, because obviously Sanskrit is not a hybrid in that way, but in not very little of it is a hybrid. But then I kept looking and I started finding levels and degrees of mixture in the languages, which made a much more exciting pattern than seeing the same thing over and over again.
Okay, so you start your book, with the example of crossbreeding of different kinds of bears,
Mhm.
and how they produce a different species altogether, and that's what you kind of that's at the core of your book, like migration, the idea of migration and mixing. So, could
Yes.
you talk a little about how Sanskrit and maybe the other Indian languages led you to discover a whole history of migration into the Indian subcontinent that led you to this whole field?
Okay, migration initially for me was just a metaphor. I thought it was a good way of possibly explaining something. And yet, as I started writing, genetic studies started coming, which told me it was not purely a metaphor, it was actually reality. And as we know with the bears and with human beings, almost all migrants who are not hunter gatherers tend to be male. So if they are male and they come and they're not thinking of going back, they have to have families or they will be extinct. And if they are um, continuing to have children, you have immediately two streams. Now, these two streams are important because we tend, for simplicity, to say we are what our fathers are, unless you're a Malayali, in which case you know you're a matrilineal stream, a Khasi or a Malayali. But we discount a half of our heritage all the way down. And slowly I began to find that the way in which humans mixed, the way in which bears mixed, uh, was very similar to the way in which languages mixed, except with languages, you could see the layers of mixture much more closely than you could in human beings. For example, the sperm donors, the males, gave the vocabulary, and we thought that is the language. Hindi has a lot of words that look a bit like Sanskrit. And then you look underneath it and you find the grammar, the scaffolding, the thing that holds it all together, the cement that holds the floor. And that came from the woman. And we don't know much about them in many cases.
Fascinating.
On Mother's Day, yeah.
Yeah. So India has a lot of, numerous languages. A lot of them officially in count, but a lot of them even not known. But there is a single thread, an argument that runs through the book, which connects the story of these different languages.
Yes.
Could you speak a bit about that?
Well, again, that in parallel with the male DNA versus female DNA, we have the male vocabulary coming in. We have obviously India is a land of migrants. All humans are originally from Africa. But we have certain times when the first Indians came, then we have the next wave of Indians, we have waves from everywhere. But except for the first wave of Indians, which was 65,000 years ago, most of the migrants were male. So they bonded onto something that was much, much older, which was why initially, before they started studying Y-DNA, they found that the female descent line was so smooth for a hugely long time back. Had no one come to the subcontinent or what? And then they discovered, yes, men had. So you're getting a sense that they come in and they are powerful. Not all migrants are powerful. There's some migrants who come in one by one. But the ones who are powerful tend to pull things together, create kingdoms, create little empires, and drag people up into their fold who were something else before.
Could you give some examples of taking the different languages that you talk about in the book?
Well, the very easiest one that I can tell you about, and which everyone in the north, until they get to Banaras, is familiar with, say Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, all the Rajasthani dialects, Punjabi, Konkani, everything across the border in Pakistan except for Brahui. We have all these languages which we are told came from Sanskrit. They have words like balak, they have words like bhavati in Sanskrit, it comes hoti in Hindi. And we say, oh yes, they came from Sanskrit. They did not. They came from the Prakrits, the words. However, the way they've been put together is completely, completely different. Everyone who's ever tried to learn Hindi, who's not from this area, struggles with the notion, firstly, that verbs have gender. That's not Sanskrit. The second thing they struggle with is the notion that when you go into the past tense, the verb does not agree with the subject, it agrees with the object in gender. Forget about person. There's no person in that. So you have maine khana khaya, but I'm female, main khati hu, but maine khana khaya. And why? And obviously there's a logical reason for it, because khaya doesn't mean ate, it means eaten. Now, there's a huge belt of territory spanning from Banaras to Baluchistan into, at one time, southern Iran and down to Konkani, where this is the kind of thinking that past tenses form in this way. I'm sure there may be somewhere else on the planet where there's something like it, but this is very unique, and it's an area. And it's an area where things have nothing to do. This formation has nothing to do with Sanskrit. It did infiltrate it. You'll find it in Kalidas. You'll find it in the Ashokan pillars and all of that. Something much, much older than Sanskrit has remained. a perception that in the past tense you say food eaten, not I ate, and that this marks an area which seems to be pretty much the zone the Harappan spread. It's not in South India. It's not in East India. It's only in this area. And from this and a few other similar things, which are not in Sanskrit, not in the Prakrits, you begin to get a sense of what might have been there before that we thought was gone. And it's gone in the sense of its surface, but the innards of it, the way we think, we still think a lot like the Harappans.
It's entrenched. It's somewhere like in the most like the deepest layer.
It's what do you call it? Operating system. We have an
Right.
old operating system.
Right. I was also thinking about in terms of, the similar stories that Indian languages have. So you begin with the book with Sanskrit and
Yes.
how migration changed what the Vedic people brought with them into,
Yes.
when it mixed with the Indian languages, which also
Yes.
brings us to the idea of racial or ethnic purity. There is nothing
Yeah.
like racial or ethnic purity, right? And
Mm.
then you draw the parallel with Malayalam and
Yeah.
how the Nambutri Brahmins then traveled southwards and they changed, and how ancient Malayalam is different from modern Malayalam because
Yes.
they took Sanskrit with them. And then you also,
Area.
it's very interesting. You take the example of the East as well, and how the how Nagamis happened
Yeah.
through visits to markets and marketplace and trade, and that's a different kind of migration, and that's what then that's where the title of the book comes from. So it's
Yeah. We get the
wanderers,
mercy.
which is migrants and merchants, and also kings. The Nambutri Brahmins later, they eventually married
Filmmakers.
into lineage and all of that.
Yeah.
And kings also later with the with Turkish and Persian and uh, how Urdu came into being.
Yeah.
So we have kings there as well. So that's how the title
Mm.
evolved.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
always
but
very complicated because not what you expect in any simple way. Like Nagamese is not a hybrid, but it is based on the language Assamese, which is a hybrid.
hmm,
Wow. So it's
hmm,
taken a hybrid and made a Prakrit out of it,
mhm,
which is exciting, that suddenly Assamese has the status that Sanskrit had with Prakrit, with
hmm,
Nagamese, and that Nagamese is taking it further, but in the same way as a Prakrit, it has not made major changes, not the
hmm,
kind of changes that, say, were made in Assamese to create
mhm,
it.
mhm,
Um, yeah, well, we have a lot of things like this, and since you mentioned the language, there's a mystery that comes there, that people who are not into linguistics think that the people who came, they changed. They did not. Nobody changes in their lifetime. The Vedic men came in and they remained the way they were. We don't know much about them. We know that they could write the Rig Veda, they could compose the Rig Veda. We don't know what else they spoke, and I'm quite sure there was something else they spoke that got lost, because it always happens with migrants that they keep their sacred language and they throw away the other one. In
mhm.
Kerala, the Syrian Christians have kept their sacred language, they threw away the other ones. The Jews who came into Kerala, they kept Hebrew, they threw away the, the languages that we know they spoke at the time of arrival,
Right.
and similarly with the Nambudris. So Sanskrit is an incomplete picture of those times.
Hmm,
Prakrit gives us a little image of it. But as you said, the people who made the changes, who started mixing, were the children. Because
hmm,
once you have children, it's a kind of article of faith that children grow up with their mothers until about the age of 5. So the age at which children are sent to school also matches that now. So until the age of 5, these little children were speaking what their mothers spoke. What did their mothers speak? They probably said Maine khana khaya, and not what they said in Sanskrit. They said that kind of thing. They maybe spoke an older language.
colloquial language.
No, a Harappan
Speech.
language, a totally pre-English Vedic language,
Mm-hmm.
which we don't have any sense of except in its skeleton having remained, and we
Mm-hmm.
speak that.
Mm-hmm.
So the children may have spoken that language. Then the I keep getting these stupid notifications above there, and I'm sick of this woman constantly messaging me. Uh, um, no, you have the children speaking what was older, which the mothers undoubtedly spoke before the men came. They must have spoken something, but they must have also spoken a Prakrit. And when we look at the Prakrit, I am going to vanish this. Yeah, yeah. When the Prakrit is amazingly not different from Sanskrit. It sounds like a Malayali speaking Sanskrit. In fact, I have heard an old Malayali woman, 90 years old, speaking Sanskrit, and I thought I was listening to Shakuntala. This is Prakrit. It's not different. It's just an accent difference in many Prakrits, and later on, a little bits of other details that are different. So you're getting a picture of some things that are just accent. You're getting a picture in Malayalam of the just certain words coming in, and then you're getting a picture over the whole north of India of uh, a coat of paint over something very old and possibly, most probably, Harappan.
Hmm. So you have this contention. I mean, the Indo-Aryan debate. I mean, the Aryan migration theory has been a very contentious debate for decades in India.
Yeah,
But last 5 years, I mean, it's been more and more kind of affirmed because of the new genetic
yeah.
research that happened. But you have a whole chapter which talks about Indo-Aryan languages, and
Mm,
the whole argument about the Aryan migration theory was based earlier on languages, but it was under debate and so on. But now with the genetic research, it's more or it's being confirmed. It's in fact no longer contested almost. So,
mm,
um, how did you make those connections? What you were just talking about? How did you make those connections that, like you said, that these the Prakrits and what the women spoke? You
mm.
talk about the Mundas, as far as I remember.
Yeah.
How do you make that connection that these were the Harappans with whom the Vedic people then associated?
I'll have to scroll you back a little to the theory that informed it, because you tend to go with a compass of a theory, and the
Mm-hmm.
theory is something that I was grew up with my first language, Creole, in the
Mm-hmm.
Caribbean, where you see the mixture, you know the history, you can match them, and you know how differently the two layers are, and that the things that do not conform to the language that gave it its words, like English, seem to conform to something else. In Creole, in the Caribbean, it is the whole West African Kwa language family. So you know that you have your skeleton from one place and you have your vocabulary from elsewhere. So, in a way, I was actually looking for that in India, not finding it quite so easily or in the same way everywhere. But since you mentioned the Indo Aryan migration, I can cut these people a little bit of slack. If you think that before the genetic studies, it was really up for grabs where these people came from. We knew there were some people based on a resemblance between Sanskrit and European languages, but I mean, for the Germans to jump in and say, yeah, yeah, they must have come from us only. Who are you, man? That we didn't know. People used to call the race. They said race Caucasians. Hello, the Caucasus has three very iffy Indo-Aryan languages, and you won't even know the names. Ossetian, you know. We it wasn't the Caucasus, and it wasn't a whole lot of place. It wasn't Turkey. We kept thinking where, but the fact that it should have jumped immediately to some nice white country in Europe was iffy. It was not fair, and so I kind of understand why an Indian would be
The
angry.
resistance. Hmm.
Yeah, because Sanskrit was the jewel in the everything, and it was just the tail end of the Indo-European family that didn't make sense. It's only piece of luck for somebody that a place in where is now the Ukraine has been the source of some of the male DNA line, and it is similar to the DNA line that not only went, the same thing happened in Europe. These are not, it's not that this whole group of people are the Europeans. No, they went into Europe and did much, much more damage than they did in India. There are places in Eastern Europe where if you do a genetic study, you will find that one man populated a whole region. He's the ancestor. I mean, we don't have that in India. We are lucky. We have so much of the past. And the past, to me, which is valuable, is not the Arya past. I mean, that's too much of it everywhere. And I'm so excited that we have the Harappans in us.
So, but how did you make that connection? So you're talking about the Creole, and that's what your sort of your framework was. So could you like elaborate that a bit? Like, how did you see the parallels?
Okay, I jumped in rather boldly into something that at least 1,000 people maybe have done their PhD thesis on. And I was understanding, but thinking on a different tack. Why? How? Not what. The what is why are these districts in Maharashtra different from each other? I find a lot of people have been studying features of the Western Indo-Aryan language. By the way, Indo-Aryan I put in inverted commas because that's only one small part of the heritage. The huger part of the heritage is something else. But it's maternal, so we don't give it its name. But I jumped boldly into there, like I often do, asking the question that wasn't asked: where did this come from? Where? And looking back and finding that old Iran had this, it's lost it. And that entire area going into southern Iran and down the western coast of India, all of Pakistan, including languages like Burushaski that are supposed to be related to nothing else on earth. There's this maternal substratum there, which is similar. So there is a huge amount of territory where similar people were there. And it matched the Creole theory that there was a different, that the scaffolding, let's pretend it's a floor. I use that metaphor. The cement holding the floor together is something very old. The pretty pieces you put in to make a pattern are new. So all the Prakrit words that came into the North Indian languages are the pretty little colorful pieces, which we think of as the language. But in fact, to me, what is the language is the maine khana khaya, or main khati hoon for heaven's sakes, or the difference between hua and ho gaya. Now, that's not in Sanskrit. It does not exist in Sanskrit. It's something else. It does exist in the South. So that's it's not like some of these features which are only in that region. This is the South as well. It's also the East. There are a lot of things that are very South Asian. I'll give you an example. We talked about it. It's a wonderful opportunity for listeners to hear the things I talk about, retroflexion. Every single language in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and most of Nepal, until you get to Assam in the northeast, and 2 tribal languages in India, the Andamans, Sri Lanka, all these languages have something called retroflexion, which is to say, ta, as in kutta, is different from ta, as in bhutta. And you have ta, tha, da, dha, and na, and then you have the back series, ta, tha, da, tha, na. And you even have, as you go further to the west and south, with Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Konkani, and then all of the south, not the north of Sri Lanka, you have la. And in the deepest south, you have r. These are
Hmm.
sounds which not only are everywhere and distributed in unevenly, but everywhere in India, almost. They're almost nowhere else. You have to really push and find somebody in New Guinea might have it. Is it important? You don't know. Someone in Queensland, in Australia, some tribe might have it. This is Indian. This is South Asian, and these it's like the bindi that you put on someone's uh, forehead when they come to your home. When a language comes to India, like Sanskrit, it gets its bindi when it is accepted and it starts putting down its roots
Hmm.
nicely until you really cannot tell it's not Indian. This is
Hmm.
a very important feature which
Hmm.
defines the subcontinent more than these little things that are a bit here and a bit there. The dirt, her, dirt, her, na, and la, and ra down in the deep south are us, in our South Asia.
Right, right. That brings us very nicely into I'd like you to talk a little more about the Prakrits and the two lines of language which you've been, talking about. The retroflexion comes from the maternal stream, and
Yes.
today's Mother's Day. So let's, talk a bit about how strongly the maternal stream actually has influenced Indian languages, which you
Okay.
just like is spread all across. And you take an example in the book about how Sanskrit, 100 years down the line, changed, and 100 or something,
700.
700
Well,
years, there was a
700.
difference that you can
Mm,
see
mm.
in a particular sound in Sanskrit, and that's what you put down to the mixing.
Yeah, not quite. Okay, I'll tell you. There was an interesting two-step process. If people are thrown together for the first time, you can bet that the change has to happen immediately. So it happens in the spoken language. However, the Rig Veda is made up of something a little bit more ornate and precious, just like Persian was precious to the Turks and the Mughals who came in. The Rig Veda represented something that they wanted to keep. So
Hmm.
there's enough evidence that
Preserve.
they spoke, they kept including these local features generation by generation in their spoken language, but they kept the Sanskrit of the Rig Veda very pristine. And that for some years, well, initially it did not have dirt, her, dirt, her, na. We can see how it has been brought in, where and why, and um, then it's kind of dissipated. It was all oral anyway. These Brahmin families were dispersed. They all had different hymns that they thought were important and kept. There were many versions of the entire Rig Veda, and they were being used, and even there was people who probably didn't completely understand them very well when they were doing their ceremonies. But at some point, about 700 years down the line, there was a decisive battle, and one of the Vedic tribes won and decided that this has got to be, we have to stop fighting among ourselves, we have to make an empire, the Kuru Empire. And one of the things that they did, not for the reasons I would like to think, but for obviously reasons to do with politics, they said, let us collect this Rig Veda. And this Rig Veda is very valuable because we will use it for Shrauta rituals to forge the alliance between Brahmins and kings so that um, we can incorporate local kings into this our system, which is again ruled by Brahmins. And I mean, in those days, people believed very strongly in the magic of ritual and certain texts. So at that time, they did a lovely thing for people like me. If I were alive, I would have been part of it. Is they told a lot of linguists go out there and note down what people are saying and kind of figure out what it is. And the people who went out 700 years later had dirt her in their speech, and they
Hmm.
started hearing it unevenly in the Rig Veda because some had it here, some did not have it. And they had lots of arguments and fights about what they really heard. And they had 22 versions of the Rig Veda, 21 have vanished. And in the process, the final decision of the final collections, all the samhitas that were put together, had this new feature that was initially only in spoken Sanskrit. And then, so the Rig Veda started being used for political purposes, to justify, to validate the Kshatriyas, and to create a nicer link. So you can see how politics, history, battles, migrations, all linked to this thing called language, which is not about speaking correctly at all. It's about events.
How language basically reflects the political and social evolution, in a sense, and the different things that happen in history. And that's what your book is doing and saying. What I found really interesting, the discussion about how offspring of these two different, so the native inhabitants, the women who were the native inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent, and the migrating people, and their offspring, how their language was influenced partly by the mothers, but when they got into formal education, then it was different. Could you talk a little about that? That was quite a fascinating story.
This is a familiar thing, not much talked about. It's not only in India, but you get a lot of cases where children born of migrations, where the mothers are one stream and the fathers are another, sometimes the mothers decide and the fathers decide that the boys are yours, the girls are mine. And hundreds of years down the line, you get a difference in how men and women speak. Let us see. Okay, Sanskrit was, for example, off limits to women at some point. All women were other. Boys, I suspect this may have something to do with the whole Janeu ceremony, where they are formally no longer other, brought in. You'll see it in modern India, North India. For example, in a lot of families who were not Muslim at all, brought up their boys knowing only how to read Urdu script and to study Farsi. And they didn't bring up their girls with that at all. Their girls learned Devanagari, or if they were sick, they learned Gurmukhi. And Muslims were not exempt from it. Muslims also, to a certain extent, being migrants, they were men. And the women were local. So until about 100 years back or so, or maybe in some families even still, the women don't speak Urdu and the men do. So you get a sense of men and women being not merely different in gender, but ethnically different. And that may have something to do with some of the problems that persist.
Right. So since you mentioned Urdu, two modern languages in India that are considered close yet apart are Hindi and Urdu. Yeah. And in the book, you talk about the unexpected influence that shaped Urdu, and what you were just saying, how Hindi is different, quite different from Sanskrit. So could you talk a little about both of these?
Okay, the use of the word Urdu. And when I first decided to write, this was the third chapter that I wrote before anything else. And I blundered again into Aligarh Muslim University and asked, tell me about the history of Urdu. They assumed that, like any educated person, I must be talking about literary Urdu. I was not. I was talking about spoken Urdu. But the first thing, I was given the date of 1780. Now that's extremely late. Aurangzeb was he still alive? He was the last major emperor. The word Urdu was not used before that. Both these Hindi and Urdu, which we now think of as two different languages, were both sometimes called, Hindi mainly. They were both called Hindi. The first time that ghazals started being written, they were not called Urdu ghazals. That was done in 1780 by Mushafi. Before that, the first ghazal written by Zattali, he called it Hindi Zuban. So, and if you look back and forget about the written, ornate, formal poetry, go back to Amir Khusro, and you listen to some of the stuff that he said when he was not writing in Braj or Awadhi, when he was writing in Dehlavi, Hindi, you wouldn't know he didn't write it yesterday. And so it was the same language. And if you look at another thing about Urdu, which you could see as, again, a parallel with Malayalam, there is nothing in Urdu from outside India except nouns, no verbs, nothing else, no numbers. It's just a few nouns. And the nouns increased as they needed more and more ornate vocabulary to say things that they already were saying in Persian. You know, it's like supposing you know very good, it's okay, here it is. Supposing you had to write something in Hindi, the sort of thing you are writing these days in English, and you're lost for a word, wouldn't you stick in an English word? It is not an effort for you. Similarly, it wasn't an effort for them. Or the Malayali Nambudris, it wasn't an effort for them to put in Sanskrit. They were doing this. They were just trying to get away from it. And when they stuck for a word, they threw in the word from the ornate language they knew before. So Urdu, to put it this way, it's like when I asked you before this meeting, should I wear this top or should I wear another top? The script you write in is very much the top that you changed before going on air. Very, very unimportant to your DNA. I look very different in red, but believe me, it's the same DNA. I can add as many nouns as I like from Japanese. I do it all the time. You want to talk about sushi, you want to talk about origami, but you're not changing the language's DNA when you just fiddle with nouns. So now I am having a senior moment for a second. How is that now going to connect to Urdu? So that basically Urdu it just experimented with a few Persian words. And what was exciting to me about Urdu is not this even. It's that the people who came in were not from Iran. They were from Central Asia, where we now call it Uzbekistan. The language of Uzbekistan is a Turkic language, not Persian, but it had the relationship to Persian that we have to English, which is not closely related to Hindi. Persian is not at all related technically to Uzbek. So the question is, these people came in, threw away their Uzbek, and kept Farsi, which wasn't their language. It's like a young Indian techie going to Silicon Valley and saying, yeah, I speak Hindi. And to teach the kid to say nana, nani, dada, dadi. And that's it. The kid never really learns to speak Hindi, but they learn Indian English. It's not American English, which is not vastly different. Okay, Indian English is a Prakrit of English. It's very, very, very close. I can't tell you which I'm speaking now, international or Indian. That's what I mean. So in other words, here come these people from Central Asia. The first line of Baburnama is in a language which you would not recognize. No Indian would recognize. Every Turk I read this out to says, yeah, of course, I know. I understand. But they didn't keep the language except for a small number of words. So again, the same thing, like the Malayalis, the Christians brought in Syriac and threw away everything else. The Nambudris brought in Sanskrit, threw away everything else. The Mughals brought in Persian and threw Uzbek straight into the bamboo end of Uzbek. So there were funny things happening. We also have not only what was kept, but what was thrown, and choices that are made. And this is a choice we're seeing made even now as we move into English from Hindi. We're seeing directions of flows, and all of these have more to do with the economy and politics than love of words and sounds.
Right. You talk about how Urdu, despite having been such a powerful, court language,
No, it
could not
wasn't.
survive.
Persian was.
Persian, sorry, but
Hmm.
I mean, somehow it did not survive. And you talk about why in the book. Could you just talk a little about that? Like why it couldn't grow roots here?
See, if I have to say Urdu is in bad shape, I have to say a lot of other languages are in exactly the same bad shape. Hindi is not in a very great shape either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you find quite a lot of children nowadays who may study Hindi but will never pick up a book in Hindi to read. Nor will they pick up a book in English. Some they're in a very in between stage. We are finding that uh, all these languages, which once defined nice worlds, coherent worlds, Urdu actually defined an empire. People on the ground were speaking it. And then when the British came, their lifeline was cut. And the British tried to foster Hindi. Basically, the divide and rule also took place in the realm of language.
Mm-hmm.
So you found the British trying to push for Shuddh Hindi on the. It was their original idea, which immediately was accepted. Yeah, yeah, how lovely. We'll take Tatsama Sanskrit words. Hello, North Indian languages do not take Tatsama words. Only Malayalam took Tatsama words, which is original Sanskrit. We took Tadbhava words from Prakrit. And suddenly the Brits, without knowing any of this, said, we're going to take out all the things from Urdu, which could not have been there before. Now, who knows what was there before? They just decided that they could excise the whole Mughal experience, their predecessors, by taking Persian words out of the language and throwing in words from Sanskrit in a very English sort of a way, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So part of the divide and rule when they took India broke Hindi and Urdu, and they did it very easily. They had a lot of ways. They were the government. So how do you deploy money to schools? How do you push schools? For example, Devanagari was not much used. You'll notice on the top of my book, there's a very strange looking script. It's called Kaithi. And I,
Mm.
being an Indian from overseas as a child, and I remember my great grandfather teaching me to write in Kaithi, and coming to India and finding people treating me like an interesting fossil. And whoa, you actually grew up with this thing. We don't even have it anymore. People were writing in Kaithi because writing was not a Devanagari activity. Devanagari linked to Sanskrit, which was memorized. So people writing in the, like all that whole thing that's on the cover of my book here is actually from a legal document. So that's they used to use this. They wrote in Kaithi and they wrote in Persian script Urdu, and it was not a religious thing.
Mm.
Devanagari was pushed at the time of the British as a all-purpose thing, not just for epics or writing down Sanskrit, and even
Mm.
Sanskrit. If you go to the real old pundits who know, like, about Parnini and so and Ashtadhyay, they know it by heart. They did not read. So it was the British idea to take Devanagari and break what was something that they didn't like, which reminded them of their predecessors.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Of
taking out your predecessor if you're remarrying
rulers,
somebody.
you mean? Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
Like the Mughals, right?
Hindi is Urdu. And everybody who's ever been to Pakistan or gone into Kashmir and spoken and discovered that they thought they were speaking Hindi and the person they're talking to thought they were speaking Urdu,
Right, right.
it's the same
And
language. We linguists do not talk of them as separate languages because, again, once you get below the surface, below the
mm,
writing system,
mm,
below a few Persian words, the bones of the maternal bones are the same.
right, got it. Yeah. But it so happened that in terms of courtly or administrative language. So Hindi, or rather Sanskritic words, maybe were given primacy over Persianate words, which
Yeah.
is why we see fewer of those now in common usage. But there's also Hindi also was sort of created after what, the 19th century,
Mm.
18th century. There was a lot of creation that happened with almost like a translation from
Yes, Sanskrit.
um, yeah, from Sanskrit, and also words in English that that you didn't have a sort of exact word for in Hindi already,
Yeah.
and they were created. Which I'm thinking of English also. Like, tell us a little about English, and how English, how it has influenced, how it came, how it was imposed, and the contemporary scene vis-a-vis English. And I mean, you make a very strong case in the book about Indian English and how it threatens existing local languages.
Yeah, it does.
So, if you could just take us through the history of English, which you sort of touch upon in the book.
Okay, first let me mention that one person we all know of as linguists, which is George Grierson, who did the Linguistic Survey of India. He was aghast at the sight of Shuddh Hindi. He said, "This is completely it's an unliving, made-up thing. Nobody talks like that." Of course,
Right.
it has begun to acquire a little life because people need technical words,
Hmm.
and
Right.
those ones have been kept. Many have not.
Hmm.
Um, English is a statement of where we are going. If we're part of the global economy, it's not the British anymore. Because
Hmm.
an interesting thing I noticed when I started looking at the documents like the Constituent Assembly documents and so was that English was not very prevalent in India while the British were here.
Hmm.
Everybody who spoke English spoke something else better,
Hmm.
spoke something at home better, preferred
Hmm.
to read. Like my father-in-law, he'd run up to a train and he'd look at the manifest in Hindi, not in English. We don't do that anymore. So when did English take off in India? After independence.
Hmm.
And that's what's so shocking. It's suddenly like the penny dropped because English basically took up the position that Persian had taken up in the time of the Mughals, and Sanskrit took up, again, a small minority language which begins to connote power and class.
Mhm.
And there's
Mhm.
nothing special about English except that it allows you to be part of the people who make decisions and are entitled to everything.
Hmm.
It could have happened with any other language if they had decided to do it.
Hmm. 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 But talk a little about how the formal education, how what you earlier spoke about, that
Yeah.
when men, I mean earlier Brahmin boys, in fact, when they started studying, and it's part of their formal education, then they get trained in Sanskrit and move away from Prakrit, and how that pattern kind of repeats. We see that now with English and the mother tongue, the Indian mother tongue. Could you talk a bit about
And
that?
mother tongue is a very strange word because the concept I have to play with a lot in the book is diglossia.
Hmm.
Diglossia basically means that for many of us, you, me, from the Caribbean, not from India, but with exactly the same situation. The first language is something local, and the second language is not an addition of a second language. It is a superimposition onto something that has begun to grow. My metaphor is a good Alfonso mango tree, which when I went to Bombay University, I said, linguists draw trees, I'm to draw you an Alfonso mango tree because it's a grafted variety. There's no such thing as growing an Alfonso from seed. You have a local root which is strong, and you lop the whole thing off, put on something more fragile that couldn't have managed at that point, strap it together, and it grows. And when it is a full tree, you will see a mark somewhere there where that strapping together happened. So you
Mm,
have a language which it comes in two parts: the child who can speak to the grandmother, to poor people, to whoever is meant to help them, in that language does not know how to say in Hindi to explain thermodynamics. I remember I was on a
Concepts.
train. Yeah,
Hmm.
that is done in English. I remember I was sitting on a train in UP with my daughter, who went to a Hindi medium school earlier. So she has no excuse then. I was talking to a professor and we were discussing the similarities between thermodynamics and social change. And she looked at me after, but you don't say that in Hindi. I said, but we just did. The point is, you can. And similarly, when I went to the US after some years, um, and I met a friend who fortunately was from South America, and her children weren't speaking English. That was wonderful. Because I couldn't understand how you speak to a child in English. I spoke to them in Spanish. And then I suddenly realized, what am I doing? This is not about the issue in India. I would get my car parked, and there were Mexicans parking there. So I spoke to them in Spanish. That was fine. I felt like I was back in India. But you go to the petrol pump, and then you can't remember how to tell the man to fill your engine or your car because you don't speak in English in a petrol pump. And so that's diglossia. That suddenly
Mm-hmm.
you know that there's some things you do in English and some things you do in your
Hmm.
first language.
Right.
And so, in a way, English has not added a world, it's stultified an earlier world. So,
Hmm.
you have an invasive species like a weed which has taken over your whole garden, and which is basically a reflection of which direction you're going. It's not a sign, it's not a healthy thing. It doesn't mean that you have two languages, it means you're
Hmm.
in transit.
In transit towards one language.
Yeah.
Hmm. 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 And and you also talk about, it's very interesting, this whole English medium, Hindi medium thing has been quite a contentious debate. It's being discussed and debated quite. There have been a couple of movies also that have come up, and
Yeah.
it's kind of connected with Indian pride and everything. But it's not only Hindi medium; it's also other languages. And
Yes.
certain states have been quite firm about it, that no, we will have our students study in a certain language till a certain age. But
Hmm.
how do you see that having an effect? Does it help having formal
I think it
education
would be
until a
wonderful.
certain? Hmm.
It would be absolutely wonderful. I have had to teach what we call EWS students.
Hmm.
And there's this strange, convenient belief that a child can learn anything up, that they are faced with in childhood. Yes, but you have to be faced with it to a certain degree of saturation. Little
Hmm.
children coming into the class and hearing the teacher spout, they may understand a bit, but they can't even engage enough to answer. I used to deal with this. I worked as a music teacher, and it
Hmm.
was a wonderful opportunity to see little children who didn't know English and to find that, like babies who are learning their first language, they can recite back to you, repeat single words. They couldn't repeat
Hmm.
sentences. And
Right.
I would sit and spend part of the class telling them in since I'm in Delhi, in Hindi, ये chimgadar hota hai. Next thing you know, they don't know what's a chimgadar because it's not a topic of discussion in the home,
Right.
because
Right.
they don't speak literary Hindi at home. So
Hmm.
words like that, so you begin to see that there is a huge mute phase, which is where the child just has to get that operating system installed, which is taking time. Because
Hmm.
apart from the fact that they're not getting enough information, enough
Hmm.
exposure, they're getting older as it happens. They can't speak like babies, they have to speak like 10-year-olds.
Right.
So I would find that it was always so much easier to explain everything in Hindi and cap it in English. And the only time I found children who could do it differently was the kids who went to Hindi medium school, because if they didn't understand something, they would tell you.
Hmm.
But EWS children in your schools do not tell you.
They were
They do
tongue
not.
tied.
Yeah, and they do not make mistakes. Until they can say something, they won't say it. But in
Hmm.
Hindi medium schools, the kids would think it's like a Lego game. They will try
Hmm.
to say something, they make a mistake, they'll laugh, they'll poke each other, they'll stop you, ma'am, वो नहीं वो समझ नहीं आया
Hmm.
वो क्या होता है, or they
Hmm.
will not make past tenses or future. That's fine.
Right.
They want to try.
Hmm.
I've only found adventurous behavior among children who grew up in a language that they understood.
Hmm. So there's some kind of rootedness, I think, that you're referring to, that one has to be rooted in a certain language first before you can then learn another language. Like what I remember from what you were just saying about being okay about making mistakes, it's like when we learned Sanskrit as an optional language much
Hmm.
later in middle school. We were okay with making mistakes
Hmm.
and getting some things wrong. It didn't come to our sense of self-esteem or
Self-worth. Yeah.
self-worth or respect for ourselves, something like that. It wasn't, because we already knew, let's say, Hindi or English.
Hmm.
We knew how to converse in those languages. We were strong in those languages already. But
Yeah.
if a child is exposed to very simple home language, at home, a colloquial language at home,
Hmm.
and a totally different formal language in school, where they have absolutely no context or background for it, then they are a bit under shock, almost they're frozen, and they can't. And so it kind of makes it difficult for them to even communicate, right?
Yeah. There's also the issue that many of the kids who are poor, and because their parents are extremely overworked, they don't sit and read to them. So their exposure to literary
Right.
versions of an Indian language are not there. Their
Hmm.
vocabulary, there's quite a lot of words that you will never know if you don't know
Hmm.
songs or have books. Why would you
Hmm.
know what a giraffe is?
Hmm.
Why would little children in the EWS section, when we would sit after school with them, they'd ask us very frankly, what's the difference between a lake and a pond? They don't know. And they want to
Right.
know these things before they can move ahead and use the
Yeah. And
concepts.
especially in cities when they don't have any access
Yeah.
to natural,
Yeah,
things,
but we
natural.
didn't need that. We got that from books.
Hmm. Right.
They don't get it from books. So there's quite
Right.
a lot of stuff. As I said, the day that Chimgada did not ring a bell to them, because that's wild information, the kind of thing that a middle class person, you got to know all the
Hmm.
animals, you got to
Right.
know, you know you got to
So
know
it's
that
not
there's
just
snow
a
on the North Pole. Why should you know that otherwise?
right, right.
So
So
that
it's not
the
just a question of Hindi versus English medium, but
no,
also class and the context that the children are
literacy,
growing up in.
literacy. Yeah,
Literacy.
and
Right.
the other thing being, as Hindi teachers tell me, that a number of kids who are technically called Hindi medium, that's not what they speak at home. They may be
Hmm.
speaking Bhojpuri, they may be
Hmm.
speaking something which they need to, which is sufficiently different from Hindi that they need to know Hindi too. The
Hmm.
shortest distance between 2 points, English and Hindi, is not a straight line.
Right.
It goes
Absolutely.
via natural um, curvature of the earth.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So, Peggy, I think we are coming to a close to the session. Let me just see if we have any questions from the listeners. I think there is one question. How is Prakrit related to Sanskrit? Um,
Okay. Okay, that's a good question. And I see it is from somebody who I turned to when I needed help on Tamil, and she clothed me very well. Sanskrit and Prakrit are amazingly similar. To think of Prakrit, you can almost say, if you spoke Sanskrit with all the kind of sandhis that you got in a Dravidian language, you'd be close to getting an early Prakrit. Of course, the Prakrits changed a little and got a little bit formalized, like at around the time of Ashoka, Pali. But even though one can see the change, that they are continuously changing, you are not seeing structural change from Sanskrit. The Ashokan pillars have karaks, they have cases, like Sanskrit. They have the same sort of sentence structure, but they just almost, the difference between Prakrit and Sanskrit is like between Babu English and British English. It's not fundamentally different. It's largely accent and a few localisms. A few things creep in, like an Indian speaking English will be likely to say this is required because he doesn't like to say I need. That kind of thing happened in Prakrit too. But it was a big difference from what came later. That when we started getting things like Hindi, and then on the other side of the planet, Bengali, Odia, Assamese, and all our dialects, those were the mixed languages. Prakrit is not very mixed, only superficially mixed. So, in fact, as I said, the first time I heard an old woman speaking Sanskrit, and she went, Om Agnimirle Purohidam. Hello? Purohitam is Purohidam. Yajnasya Ritvijam. You're seeing things simplified, and you kind of know that the Prakrit was the response of people who had sufficient access to Sanskrit speakers to understand them well and to just bring in their local accent a bit. I'm talking as a linguist. Obviously, class-wise, you can tell this is not a Brahmin. But to me as a linguist, I'm seeing somebody who did a good job of learning Sanskrit, but it was a few steps in accent a little bit away.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Madhav Deshpande says, wonderful
Ooh,
fear
my
communication.
professor.
Yeah, on a complicated subject. He asks, what is EWS? That's economically weaker section.
Yeah, the term that is used, economically weaker section, because at one time the private schools were asked to take in, and initially it was a smaller amount. Now it's, I think, 25% of their intake of children who are not merely Hindi medium or local language medium, but also poor, which is below, I think, 1 lakh annual income, which is really saying low. I mean, we have people who are laborers who are earning more than that. So technically, these children were also had other deficits. I was completely shocked at the age of 3 in a new environment, unable to speak, listening. And I would find very often these little children in class would be yawning, looking out the window, not because we are boring, but because it is a mental overload to try to follow. If you've ever, for example, like I had once to go to a conference in South America and present my paper in Spanish, it was fine, I did that. And at lunchtime, I was seriously hoping not to have to speak Spanish. And then a bunch of students came and sat at my table. And I just knew it was going to drain my energy. I know how those kids feel.
Right.
You're
Right.
just tired. Just fall asleep in your class.
It's too much effort. Too much effort. There's another question by Visham. How would you say Trinidad Bhojpuri contributed to Trinidad English Creole?
I don't know. I see little touches here and there. I still remember, like, my grandmother saying things like about my great grandfather was cleaning a piece of jewelry and he coming into this. So he was brushing coming. That's not Creole. That's Bhojpuri. We have a few things. I think that what is more interesting in Trinidad is that you get something where you cannot say for sure whether something has come from Bhojpuri or from some other source. And when you start finding things like that, like reduplication, a big thing. Now, is that African or is it Indian? So very often you have this kind of thing happening. I think in Trinidad, we have the situation where Creole was so accessible to Indians who first came that though the attempt was to teach us Hindi in school, we failed. And to teach us English, we also failed. Nobody taught us Creole, we learned it. And so much so that the oldest Indians are the best repositories of a form of the language that Africans have abandoned by now. They've moved on because it's native to them. You talk to these old people who I know you also record because I know your work. If you speak to them in English, you will be hearing things that people don't say anymore. So they had access. And it's similar in the US. Black Americans did not have the experience of Caribbeans because a huge number of white people who were poor enough to speak to them in English. So they developed a distinctive English, but it was not a Creole English.
Great, thank you. That's a comment from a listener. It was a treat.
Hi.
So Peggy, a personal question. How many languages do you know?
That's a question I don't know how to answer because it depends upon for what purpose. There are times when, oh, thanks, Gomti. There are times when I think I am managing my Hindi well, and then some journalist comes and asks me about philosophy, and I have to stop and think.
Right.
And
but let's say familiarity. How many languages do you have more or less fluency, familiarity with, which you can communicate in?
Is my first language. I know English. It took me as long as it took you because I had to approach slowly through something similar to English. French and Spanish I studied, and I studied Latin, which is why when I learned Sanskrit, I said, I've seen this thing before. Its words were similar, karaks were similar, everything was there. I learned Latin, and my father loved it, so it was something between us. French and Spanish, I suddenly started thinking, this is Hindi and Punjabi, this is Hindi and Bengali, and then I started messing around with things here and there, enough of nouns to get by in Iran or Turkey. In Japan, I found Japan absolutely blew my mind because now I know that we had a migration from that direction into the East because everything I found in Japanese was familiar. So that just like you have in Bengali, ekta, dutta, ekjon, duja, that's Japanese.
Okay, so interesting.
And how do I tell my Japanese friends, no, you don't have to explain anything. We have seen it, and then I was moving around in Indonesia. Basically, like in India, the first line of attack is nouns. Learn the nouns. You want to buy things, you know the word for this, you know the word for that. You know a few key things that I want, And so I move around a lot of countries without getting too scared of anything. Italian, I started out by speaking in Spanish. And by the end of the week, I knew I could boldly imitate them and try to make it Italian. And I was, there must have been one or two people who thought I was speaking Italian. Portuguese, going around in Brazil. And, like I say when I'm in Goa that I understand Portuguese, but technically I don't. It's like saying I don't know Prakrit and Pali technically. I've never studied it. But since Professor Deshpande is there, I remind you how he did it with us. He just said, Sanskrit? Here's a grammar book for Pali. Here's a dictionary. Here's a text. Please get busy. And I said, but don't you have to teach me anything? He said, no. And then slowly you learn, for example, I'll give you a nice example. Bhavati means he, she, or it is in Sanskrit. Bhavati, bhav. In Pali, it's hoti. Doesn't that sound like Hindi? But it's not Hindi. It's actually Bhavati. So you have this interesting thing, and you get to know that when you see this, you see the change, the direction towards Hindi. But of course, there's a big gap it has to cross. And you find that you can understand it.
Nice.
With a little help. I mean, you struggle. I used to sit when I did Sanskrit. I sat up every night till 3 a.m. with 4 fingers in the dictionary to keep. I can now find anything in Sanskrit or Hindi top speed in the dictionary.
Right. Right. Much practice.
Yeah.
Right. There's a question, very interesting question by Nilesh Shukla. How could a single script be created for India? Is that even viable?
Well, does it even need to be? It's a question, because I once thought of, for example, I wrote a software for Hindi, which would be based on Sanskrit logic and what all. And I went and I took it to somebody, and they said to me, and I swear, he said, Hindi mein koi scope nahi hai. He said to me in Hindi, Hindi mein koi scope nahi hai. So we want to do this. We try to do this. There are many scripts which transliterate very fast. With it's not necessary. You can type in Google in English and it comes out in Hindi, not perfectly well. You have to make choices, and so
Yeah.
um, the question is, there's a race going on, the race of English to obliterate everything, and the race of technology to create these scripts which can work very fast. Um, and there's very little encouragement in the market to develop these things. Believe me, I
Mm,
tried. I want to. I have the thing. I can write the software almost. I need a little help. And everybody says, what's the point?
mm, mm, mm.
It's
Right.
a big problem. And this problem is not linguistic.
Right. Right. Great. So I think we've kind of a little bit overshot time. So let's bring this to a close. I'd like to just say for me personally how it's been, reading the book, working on the book. I've always been fascinated by the commonality of words and wondered about their origins, like pater, father, papa, like that. And there are then Urdu words that ended up recognizing when I would watch Iranian or Turkish drama, and I would
Right.
wonder how they are connected. And so this book was really exciting for me to begin with. And I feel that your book, while it's rooted in how languages work, it zooms out and gives us a larger story of human history and how we're all connected, the similarities in the stories of languages, and also of human behavior. And quite fascinatingly, why languages last or don't last.
Hmm.
A lot of it is that as well. And we talked about English medium education, that because it's a contemporary subject, I found it quite fascinating. But best of all, I absolutely love your storytelling, and I can read the book multiple times and still chuckle in number of places. So it's an absolutely enjoyable, exciting read. So
I must
thank
also
you.
add one thing important.
Yeah.
Your contribution, apart from all the editing and really going through, must have been totally new terrain for you. Richa gave me the title, and she had to manhandle me very gently because I was seeing it as a linguistics book, and she had to take a long time to tell me, no, it is not only that.
Yeah.
And then slowly, slowly, I first said, kicking and screaming, said, okay. And then people started saying it's a nice title. So this is Richa.
Thank you, Peggy. But it's an absolute pleasure working on the book. And like I said, I can read it multiple times, and I've been recommending it all across. Like since last year, it was supposed to come last year, but because of the pandemic, it got delayed. But since then, I've been recommending it to everybody. So thank you all for joining us. Please pick up this groundbreaking book. Thank you, KLF, again, and thank you, Peggy, for this session. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Richa, for
Okay,
keeping me on
bye
track.
bye.
Bye bye.